Welcome to the Walker Arts Center tonight for our Target-Free Thursday night program. I'm Olga Viso. I'm the executive director here at the Walker, and on behalf of all of us at the Walker, thank you so much for joining us for this special lecture by author and curator Paul Chaat Smith, entitled The Americans. We're really pleased to be presenting this as an affiliated program in conjunction with the exhibition Jimmie Durham at the Center of the World. This is an exhibition that surveys nearly the 50-year career of American artist Jimmie Durham, and that's on view in our Target Friedman galleries and will be on view through October 8th. And the galleries are open till 9 o'clock if you have a chance after the talk. Paul Chaat Smith is a Comanche author, essayist, and curator. His books and exhibitions focus on contemporary landscape of American Indian politics and culture. And his upcoming exhibition, which is called The Americans, which opens at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. on the National Capitol Mall later this year, addresses, and he's going to be previewing that exhibition with us a bit this evening. That exhibition addresses the question, how is it that Indians are present everywhere? In the form of place names, popular culture, advertising, sports teams, names, weapon systems, yet barely present in history and largely absent from the great national debates of our time. And for the last 16 years, he has been exploring and unpacking that question in his work as a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. He joined the staff there as a curator in 2001 in advance of the opening of the new museum in 2004. And there he's organized really some memorable exhibitions and important exhibitions, including a core part of the inaugural history installation that opened the National Museum's new building in 2004. And it's an exhibition that was entitled Evidence, Gold, Guns, Bibles, that looked at 500 years of Native history and the intersection with North America's newcomers. And he collaborated with several curators on that. And I would say I had the pleasure of seeing that exhibition and walking through the show with Paul. Such a poignant and powerful exhibition that I won't forget seeing, that I think challenged conventional Western historical framing of Native history. And I think it also demonstrated that, for me, that Paul is not only a masterful writer, historian, and thinker, but also approaches his curatorial practice with a really strong artistic sensibility. It was really a beautiful installation. Other projects that Paul has organized at the Smithsonian include a project with performance artist James Luna and Mendatio at the 2005 Venice Biennale, Fritz Scholder, Indian Not Indian in 2008, Brian Jungen's Strange Comfort in 2009. And I first got to know Paul in the mid-2000s in Washington as we were fellow curators and colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution, and I was at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden at the time, and we were working to try to collaborate together. So I'm especially pleased that we could welcome you here today, Paul, and that you could share some of the great work that you've been doing at the Smithsonian for a number of years now. In addition to Paul's curatorial practice, he's published several important books with Robert Warrior. He's the author of Like a Hurricane, The Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, 1996. This is a standard text in Native Studies and American history courses. And his second book, which you can pick up in the Walker shop if you don't have it, Everything You Know About Indians is Wrong, was published in 2009 at the University of Minnesota Press, and it's now in its second printing. He was appointed critic in residence 3 times in galleries in the U.S. and Canada, and his exhibitions and essays have explored the work of Richard Ray Whitman, Bako Ohama, Faye Heavyshield, Shelley Nairo, Erica Lord, and Kent Monkman. He has lectured at the National Gallery of Art, Center for Arts in San Francisco, and the Getty Center for the History of Art and Humanities in Los Angeles. He's had television appearances as well in 1995, the Canadian series Markings with Neil Bissendeth, and served as creative consultant for the American Experience series We Shall Remain, a Native History of America broadcast on PBS in 2009. So tonight we're going to be hearing Paul speak about his forthcoming exhibition, The Americans, among other topics, and this talk that he's developed specifically for the Walker. And I would say the Americans is also, happy to say, is also being published with the University of Minnesota Press, the catalog that you're working on in conjunction with that exhibition that opens in November. So please, a big round of applause and welcome to Paul Chaat Smith.
Hi, Minneapolis. So this is where I'm supposed to say how pleased I am to be here and how much I've been looking forward to this evening. Well, actually, no. It's not that I've been dreading tonight. I would say it's more anxiety with a twist of dread and a splash of fear. And naturally, I've been looking for ways out. I thought about canceling, but no, that would make me look bad, and looking bad is the main thing I'm afraid of. So here's a problem. I've been a native art critic for 30 years. A critic's job is to take positions, and I'm good at that. I specialize in the big, sweeping narrative. I argue Fritz Scholder's stubborn views on his own complicated identity are central to understanding his work, and I anoint Indian with a beer can as the greatest painting in the history of the field. I propose that James Luna's artifact piece effectively divided Indian art into two eras. The first is called before, the second after. I've known many of our best artists for decades. I watched it all unfold when I lived in New York in the 1980s, and later when I attended a kind of graduate school in the 1990s in Regina and Saskatoon and Thunder Bay and Banff and other places too cold to mention. And later at the Smithsonian when I organized projects in Venice and Washington. Before all that, a book on the American Indian movement. According to my publicists and press clippings, I'm a wry, sharp-edged, fearless observer of the Indian scene. So given all that, it would seem that offering my views on the Jimmie Durham crisis is simply part of my job. When you throw in my close friendship with him going back to the 1970s, it appears to be mandatory. I kept looking and looking for a loophole, but no loophole arrived. So this controversy has been bitter and painful, for one reason, because I know nearly everyone involved. I know all the Indians. I know Olga. I know Ann Elgood, who curated at the Center of the World. And hey, bonus, I even know Sam Durant. I like them all. The field of native art just isn't that large. I hesitate to say we're like a family because, most importantly, that's so not a PCS thing to say. Yet in many respects we are, at least if we stipulate a very large and very messy extended family. Like any real family, some of us do hate each other, but we agree on the important things. We agree the best native art is equal to any in the world. We agree it's been overlooked and ignored and are committing to changing that. We cheer for each other's success. Well, I personally don't know everyone in the anti-Jimmie Durham campaign. I know most of them, and I believe they are coming from a sincere, and I have to say, extremely passionate place. Parenthetically, I'll say I have a new appreciation for that amusing line about moral outrage being the millennials' drug of choice. Wow. So much passion, so much certainty. I confess that dread is also about something else. About 10 years ago, I became a little bit popular. Don't get me wrong, I fully understand this is nothing like being really popular, nowhere close to being famous. I'm none of those things. But my essays started ending up on freshman reading lists. There'll be a line of text on somebody's Facebook signature that I wrote. I'd routinely meet total strangers who knew my work. And what I discovered is I liked being a little bit popular. It was fun. I remembered Elvis Costello talking about the time Oliver's Army made it to the UK Pop 10, and how for about 10 glorious, never-to-be-repeated minutes, he was a for-real pop star. Everything you know about Indians is wrong was my Oliver's Army moment. I followed up the Fritz Scholder project with Brian Young and Strange Comfort, another smash hit, and all was fine. or so I thought. I presented at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association some years ago, raising questions about how touchy we've all become about everything, and also a paper called Genocide: A Love Story, which raised questions about genocide. Probably the best thing I'd written in years, and the response was very good. Even the genocide scholars liked it. But when it came time to prepare my essay for publication, I chickened out. I didn't want to lose fans for being soft on genocide. I started pulling punches. I realized I not only wanted to remain a little bit popular, I actually wanted to become even more a little bit popular. Remember that great scene when Walter White finally told Skyler the truth about why he became a drug kingpin? Turns out it wasn't the money or the cancer. Walter White said, because I liked it. So this isn't a good thing for a critic. Anyway, after tonight, maybe I won't have to worry so much about being popular anymore. In her autobiography, Chrissie Hynde wrote about terrifying gigs at horrible motorcycle bars where physical assault was all but guaranteed. She played them anyway. It's the job. Sometimes, she explained, you just have to walk the plank. So, the most incendiary and also the most interesting charge leveled at Durham is that he is a white man who for decades has perpetuated ethnic fraud. I believe this to be untrue, and I'll explain why. While I know positions have hardened, and I'm not likely to convince those who've argued the other side, I do want to start with some areas of agreement. I agree Indian nations in the United States must be the arbiters of who is a citizen and who is not. I agree many tribes have been harmed by people who falsely claim tribal citizenship or cultural affiliation. I agree tribal sovereignty is always, to greater and lesser degrees, under attack, and there's no guarantee it will exist in 20 or 50 years. I also believe that if Jimmie Durham was a white man who's told countless lies about his identities, it would fundamentally change how his career should be viewed. On this, I have common ground with his critics. If this were true, I would be right there with them. And obviously, it would end my relationship with Durham and forever change how I view his work. To me, there are only really three possibilities. The first is what I believe to be the case. Jimmie Durham was born into a Cherokee family, has never considered himself anything but Cherokee, and neither did anyone else in his family. The second is that maybe there was some Cherokee, something or other in his family history going way back, but for all intents and purposes, J.D. was born into a white Arkansas family, at some point convinced himself he was Cherokee, and over time embellished these tenuous connections to make it seem he was always Cherokee instead of someone who later became his version of that. And this would be very lame if true. The last is that he's a straight-up white person who knew he was a straight-up white person, lied about being a straight-up white person, consciously built a false identity about his past, and for the last 60 years has profited by being a fake Indian. And I have to say it's the Jimmie is white man scenario that I think is most interesting. It would mean that for decade after decade, I've personally been the victim of a carefully orchestrated ethnic fraud, one that took place on Sioux reservations right here in Minneapolis, New York, Venice, San Francisco, Geneva, Berlin, and other places, every decade from the 1970s to the present. It would mean all those casual stories about Arkansas, the family anecdotes, the pictures he showed me, his adventures in Houston and Austin, everything he said about his early life were lies. So I'm sure that's not true. But here's the thing. I'm not wired for absolute certainty. I love doubt. I love confusion. Sometimes I even love being wrong. Anything's possible, right? If Jimmie Durham is a fraud, it would rank somewhere between two poles for me. The first would be finding out my parents were actually KGB officers. The second would be a colleague that you've known for decades, whose house you visited, who shared stories of their childhood and their siblings. You met their spouse and have friends in common. And you find one day every single thing they told you about their past was a lie. Hard to imagine what that would feel like. But I'm sure it would make me feel dumber than a box of rocks, which, in a way, would be deeply interesting. The anger and fire in this debate has surely come from the certainty on the part of the critics that it's the last scenario, Jimmie Durham is a white man, that is true. Because if it were the other scenarios where the main issue is citizenship, I think there'd be a little sympathy. Jimmie never claimed to be a citizen. He never pretended to. And the fact is, anyone who knows eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas knows there are a great many people who consider themselves Cherokee. Not Cherokee descendants, but Cherokee, who are not citizens. And I'm not talking about Senator Warren or Sarah Vowell or other people that have said they have Cherokee background. I'm talking about people who say they're Cherokee and are not enrolled. These are people who have nothing, no agenda, nothing to gain, but simply believe their family histories. Now here, the tough but defensible argument is that the Cherokee Nation can no longer allow people who are not citizens to identify themselves as Cherokee, period. And any honest person would have to concede this is a big change, that this idea no one can be Cherokee except those who are citizens of one of the three recognized Cherokee nations. That's radical. That's new. Jimmie Durham does not just happen to not be enrolled. He's never tried to be enrolled, never wanted to be, opposes enrollment, and fundamentally is opposed to the Cherokee government at Tahlequah. How can that be okay for someone who believes that to be the most internationally renowned Cherokee artist? That's a fair point. One curious thing about the debate over these past months is these omission or forgetting that not so long ago, there was deep skepticism about tribal governments in our crowd. It was even a badge of honor. After all, the American Indian movement's crowning achievement was the attempted overthrow of the legal and popularly elected government at Pine Ridge in 1973. Yes, we can say, but that was a corrupt puppet government that should have been overthrown. When, I wonder, did they all quit being neocolonial puppets? Anybody got a date? Do we think it was only Pine Ridge that was rotten and the others are pretty good? Even if they are all pretty good now, which we all know they're not, it's striking to see artists and scholars so anxious to show their loyalty to these institutions. I noticed years ago Indian academics bragging they had vetted their research with tribal governments. Call me old school, but I believe artists and scholars should operate with a degree of skepticism towards state authority. Unlike Jimmie Durham, I am proud to be a United States citizen, and I love my fabulously screwed up country. But I also have profound disagreements with it on a daily basis. Likewise, I support tribal sovereignty. I want it to continue, and I understand it's always at risk. I further understand many tribes and national organizations are deeply flawed. Now, I'll admit I'm not a very good citizen of the Comanche Nation. Haven't been to Comanche Fair since the 1990s. When I get those absentee ballots, which seem to come every 4 days, I let them sit around for weeks, thinking this time I should really investigate the candidates or vote on some impenetrable policy change. I never do. If you apply this standard, some advocate things like actively participating in cultural activities, learning songs and dances and so forth. I would be disenrolled in a heartbeat. I don't live in Oklahoma, and if family members didn't live there, I would rarely, if ever, visit. But I have this tribal membership card, so I'm Comanche. But that doesn't mean I know anything. Identity is not knowledge. I also think the anti-Durham people are much too hard on Lucy Lepard and Jean Fisher and those European curators. It is asking far too much to expect them to have investigated Jimmie's identity and become experts on the intricacies of tribal enrollment. On the other hand, the campaign is much too lenient with the scores of well-known Indian artists and curators who have supported Durham since the 1970s. These are the people who should be held to account for enabling this alleged fraud to continue. People like myself. Why are you giving us a pass? We all knew Jimmie was not enrolled. And we also knew he fundamentally disagreed with that very concept. We all knew his Cherokee identity was controversial. I can assure you if myself or any of these colleagues believed Jimmie was a white man, they would not have exhibited with him or written about him. What most of us thought was that his not being enrolled was not determinative of whether someone was Cherokee or not. This is fine to disagree with that position, but it feels cheap to denounce the Lucy Lepards and barely mention the many leading Native writers, artists, and scholars who never saw what was so blindingly obvious to those critics. And if the question is why the art world didn't see all this sooner, with the clarity of Durham's critics, I'll tell you why. It's because for decades he's worked closely with many Indian artists, has championed Indian art, including some of our most accomplished. These white curators and critics didn't ignore the controversy. For the most part, they knew all about it and saw an Indian art crowd divided on the issue. So once again, the real blame shouldn't be assigned to these all-powerful white curators who in this narrative are only interested in Durham and other Indian artists, but people like myself who one way or another validated him time after time for many years. The other suggestion I would make is to maybe dial back the rhetoric about being Cherokee, enrolled or not. Everyone knows the unofficial state religion of the Oklahoma Cherokee is Southern Baptist Christianity. Everyone knows in many ways Oklahoma Cherokee aren't so different than other Oklahomans. When I read the lofty sentiments about stomp grounds and sovereignty, I wonder what part of eastern Oklahoma they're talking about. This is a deeply red and southern place. And the Comanche, sort of the Yang to Cherokee yin, still in Oklahoma. You know, when I sometimes read highfalutin rhetoric, I wish I could show the New York art world Facebook posts from my Comanche relatives. Their politics makes Fox News seem like the propaganda arm of European social democrats. So what is our role in all this? I think we're outsiders. Let's be honest, the most popular novelist in Indian country isn't named Alexei or Erdrich. It is and always will be Tony Hillerman. Most Cherokees have never heard of my friend Kay Walking Stick. Yes, enrolled, though she spent more time in Italy than Tahlequah, whose solo show at NMAI dazzled crowds last year. And if they ever encounter the likes of everyone's favorite new indigenous art collective, Post Commodity, they would be baffled, bored, or both. But not me, I like you guys. You know what, that's all okay, really. But the usual default stance of cutting-edge scholars and artists, as partisans on all sides of this debate consider themselves, is oppositional. Yes, in times of great crisis, World War II or 9/11, we may be at one with state power. Jimmie Durham's identity does not rise to that level. Our job should be to be skeptics, to be critical, and to ask questions. I'm curious about a new trend among my colleagues in Indigenous studies. They are fond of using the term settlers to refer to basically everyone they see on a daily basis who's not Indian. When I first heard it, I thought it was a joke. I've been thinking a lot about a statement by a Mohawk artist named Skawanati. She was wondering why so few Native artists ever make work about their white relatives and family members and significant others. I suppose those artists whose extended families are pure red all the way down are off the hook, but not really because they probably don't exist, and also because Skawanati's critique is about curiosity and range. But what she's talking about are the Native people she knows. They're not bitter experiences with these white people. They're their family. They're their spouses. And yet somehow that somewhere somebody might make some art that involves them, and it's curious. That seems to never show up. Why is Indian art and photography only and exclusively about Indians 24/7? Somehow being an Indian artist or scholar means creating a bizarre wall between how our lives are actually constructed and lived and our intellectual work. It's especially weird given how many of these folks have white spouses who manage their art careers. They deserve a place on your canvases. They deserve a place in the books that we write. To this end, I'm seriously considering a campaign to bring back the term half-breed. I'll let you know how that goes. There's another new trend I absolutely hate, and am baffled that people I deeply respect are on board. It's called the politics of citation, and it seems to have started in Canada. not so long ago the home of the smartest and most talented Indian artists on the planet. This flavor of the politics of citation seems to involve making a declaration, perhaps in the manner of Chief Joseph, never again to cite a person in your writings who is not indigenous. This is, how should I put this, unfathomably stupid. I expect this will soon be followed by indigenous art histories which refuse to acknowledge Picasso or Warhol or Basquiat, who, after all, they're just settlers anyway. They have nothing to teach American Indians. Come on, people, this is crazy, building a dumb little prison and sealing yourself off in it. Stop it. So it brings me back to an even bigger question than who is Jimmie Durham, and that is, who are we? I insist we're a band of malcontents, rebels, gnome weirdos, dark dreamers, and troublemakers, or we're nothing. If your tribal chairman loves your book or your art installation, okay, well, I'm not saying for sure there's something wrong with it, but the odds are pretty good there's something wrong with it. Take it from me, we're never going to be popular. Not really. So let's stop trying and focus on what we're good at. Writing books that don't sell and making art that nobody buys. Because it's important, people. It's because somebody has to do it. Okay, I don't know why exactly. Does it even matter? It's our job, okay? We're not supposed to be cheerleaders, but interrogators. We don't need more boosters. We're not the Chamber of Commerce. And to that end, as the country is engaged in controversies over Confederate monuments, I believe it's a good moment for Native artists to take a stand on the Confederate memorials erected by Indian nations who passionately believed in enslaving African Americans, who fought with the Confederacy until the final days of the Civil War. Tell me again the reason those monuments shouldn't come down and the reason this history should not be interrogated. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of saying things like, quote, compared to the Comanche, the Sioux were a bunch of Girl Scouts. I still like the line. But the historical record, just as it is on the 5 civilized tribes' profound commitment to enslaving black people, is crystal clear about the political economy of the Comanche Empire. It was not a resistance struggle against the United States. It barely noticed or cared about the United States for most of the 19th century. The Comanche Empire was built on the rape, murder, and enslavement of Indians and Mexicans, and in a very distant third, some white settlers, who actually were settlers. At some point, Comanche scholars, artists, and critics should begin acknowledging that. And we should apologize for, among other things, doing everything we could to exterminate the Apache, without the jokes. I know that sounds harsh, but history is harsh and spares no one. Human beings throughout time and across the world demonstrate pretty much the same measure of brutality and grace. Talking about this part of our histories is a price of seeing Indians as fully human, not New Age forest bunnies. And I see it as a powerful blow against white supremacy to insist that vast amounts of post-contact Native history is not a binary struggle between settler and the indigenous. That history is complicated and scary and dense precisely because it centers around political agendas of Indian peoples rather than a neatly constructed 21st century fantasy that everything that ever happened to us is about the white man. It wasn't. It isn't. These are difficult but worthy projects for my intellectual brothers and sisters who consider themselves social justice warriors. Join me if you dare. So, if I had a really good transition, it would go right here. Also, a public service announcement. I am here representing the Smithsonian. They are kind and good people who grant their curators long leashes to express their views. So please understand the preceding commentary is my own and does not necessarily represent the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of the American Indian, or Major League Baseball. All right? Now I'm going to talk about the project I've been working on for the past 7 years, an expensive and massively ambitious exhibition that is opening in Washington real soon, end of the year. It's the best thing I've ever done, and I predict it's going to be really, really popular. Now, the fact is, I'm a pretty comfortable guy living in a rich country, but Nam June Pike is my curatorial spirit animal because my job is to engage 1 million visitors a year. Most of them will spend just 15 or 20 minutes in my exhibition. They live, as we all do, in a world where information is virtually free, always accessible, surrounded by astonishing imagery and entertainments to match every conceivable taste. My job is to deliver an emotionally and intellectually powerful visual experience to an audience of every conceivable demographic. Often they are bored and cranky, and, well, I have to say, badly dressed. Lately, many are wearing bright red baseball caps with inspiring patriotic slogans. And you know what? I love them all. The success of this project depends on whether I have an impact, whether this becomes the thing they talk about when they go home. What I'm up against is that my exhibition is just one of several at NMAI, and that building is flanked by a dozen other Smithsonian museums, all world-class, all offering free admission, closed only on Christmas Day. You can imagine how jealous I am of my friends who are college professors with their captive audiences and required readings and all those months of classes. So much power. I have no power. I have no leverage, no reading list, no grade to punish or reward. So, like Nam June Pike, I have to be as entertaining as fast as I can. The assignment for this show came straight from the top. Kevin Gover, the NMAI director, said we must create exhibitions that are more effective, that reach our actual audience, not some imagined audience, and drive home the message that the Indian experience is not just interesting or sad or inspiring. Rather, that the Indian experience is foundational to the United States. Sure, that sounds fine, but why this message? Because Kevin is convinced that the more people understand about American Indians, the better our chances are to preserve tribal sovereignty. He notes that many of the most devastating legal opinions were based not on bad law, but on bad history. Incorrect facts, such as the land was empty or Native people did not practice agriculture. He believes that over time, a better informed public will shape policies that benefit Indian nations. So he's told his staff that he believes NMA has been very effective at preaching to the choir. He says, mission accomplished. And moving forward, we must be all about preaching to the congregation, people who don't always agree with us. And so we're reframing our work as being that of a truly national museum of the United States rather than an ethnic museum. In other words, our particular interest is in how American Indians have shaped the United States at large. For example, how Indian removal changed the entire country and was arguably the biggest event between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And not just because how it devastated Indians. And it doesn't mean presenting just the Indian view of these events, which is always fake because there's never one Indian view of anything, but taking a larger view. What we are no longer doing is that we're no longer staying in our lane. Kevin Gover's an optimist. He says, quote, the NMAI believes in the American people and American institutions and are convinced that when they are properly informed, they will support programs, projects, and policies that promote the self-determination of Native nations. And following his example, Americans is an optimistic, forward-looking exhibition. My task, along with the original core team of Kathleen Ash-Milby and Gabi Tayak, is to translate these ideas into three-dimensional space for busy, distracted visitors. We talked a lot about why people visit the Smithsonian and how the biggest draw is the chance to stand in front of an iconic object you've heard about your entire life. The Hope Diamond, Lincoln's Stovepipe Hat, the Apollo 11 Command Module, Dorothy's ruby slippers, Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. No technology, no book or image can top standing in front of one of those things with only plexiglass between you and it. Nothing ever will. So we ask, what are those iconic objects for us? Our collection is full of extraordinary and dazzling works, yet there's nothing really that fits that bill. We have a rifle that was given to Geronimo, but that's not the same thing. You don't want to see Dorothy's handbag or Neil Armstrong's Ford Fairlane or Linky's khakis. You want to see the specific, ultra-famous thing you've heard about your entire life. But we realize we do have something. They aren't objects exactly. They are the handful of events and stories that every American has heard of. Maybe there's a dozen. After exploring ways of beaming vast amounts of information and insight into our visitors' brains in some unobtrusive way during their 15-minute tour, technology isn't ready, but check back in 5 years, we quickly adopted the mantra of meeting people where they are. What people already know, however imperfectly, that became our mantra and became the common ground of the exhibition. So the things people know from history that involve Indians, maybe a dozen things. We ended up going with Thanksgiving, Pocahontas, Trail of Tears, and Little Bighorn. I can't go in detail on the treatment, but trust me, it's not like anything you've encountered before. The larger territory of the exhibition rests on what we call Indians everywhere. In 2017, in this country of 320 million, Indians are perhaps 1% of the population. There are more Indian Americans than American Indians. In the Twin Cities, the Southwest, upstate New York, some other places, Indians are present in daily life of Americans. But for most Americans, the vast majority, Indians are not present, and Indians are invisible. Yet paradoxically, Americans are deeply familiar and emotionally connected with Indian imagery, with Indian place names, with Indians and the fabric of American life. Back when the decade was young, I was snowed in at O'Hare and read in one gulp a novel by a promising young writer from right here in Minneapolis. It turns out to be my favorite Louise Erdrich book. For one thing, I didn't feel I needed a doctorate in genealogy to understand who was who. And also, it's hilarious and oh so dark. Recommend it. Anyway, this line stuck with me. We've lost the franchise and we'll never get it back. I ask myself, as I'm sure many of you have, well, what if Louise is wrong? What if there's a way to return the franchise back to the Red Nation? So my curatorial team looked closer and realized we had severely underestimated the beast of Indians everywhere. And really, that's its true genius, shape-shifting and deflection, what we in the cultural criticism trade call normalizing. Indians have been the wallpaper of American life for centuries, and wallpaper is designed not to call attention to itself. It's just there. We're trained to ignore it. Pay it no mind, the imagery and place names tell us. And it somehow worms this idea into our heads. There's nothing unusual about it. And yet I'm here to tell you there's nothing like Indians everywhere. People say, well, Paul, what about the Notre Dame Irish or the Dallas Cowboys? I laugh and say, let's count. There have been thousands of teams with Indian names. But then I say, hey, I'll give you the sports names. Let's call it even. Show me what other ethnic group has been the face of airlines and insurance companies and brake fluid and whiskey and cigarettes and software and hotels and motorcycles and surface-to-air missiles and luxury sports cars and attack helicopters and bottled water and atomic bomb tests and baking powder and fruit boxes and a third of the states and streets in every town and every city in the country. So this opened up the paradox for us that most Americans know very little about Indians, yet from their earliest memories, Indians are part of their lives, and it never goes away. It's just that these aren't actual Indians. It's the idea of Indians manifested in advertising and place names and cars and weapons and sports teams. The deeper we explored this, the more we found. Eventually, this became the rocket fuel that powers the entire exhibition. So, the big idea, Indians everywhere. There's nothing like this anywhere else. And it turns out that the most American thing ever is, in fact, American Indians. How crazy is that? Americans, the exhibition sees Indians everywhere as profound visual evidence that the country is acknowledging there's no United States without the indigenous. And it's an emphatic, though subconscious determination on the part of Americans to always remember it, no matter what. The Japanese have a name for this, what we're trying to do with the show. We're building an experience visitors will see for the first time what has been around them their entire lives and move past the shiny distractions of stereotype, cultural appropriation, kitsch, to see a bigger and more profound picture. In a way, the most radical thing about our project is our insistence on treating our visitors, overwhelmingly non-Indians, with respect and even affection. I so much want people to have a good time. We even have big sofas in the largest gallery, not the benches you usually see. I don't want people to feel guilty. When has that ever advanced Indian interests? I've written about Indian imagery and romanticism since the 1990s, and what fascinated me was how the phenomenon was never just one thing. It was a shapeshifter. It always felt reductionist to say stereotype or racist, because it's so much more than that. And we began seeing the opportunity to surround visitors with the Indians have known all their lives, with these familiar, comforting presences, as a way into a more profound engagement. The goal is to create a situation where visitors feel empowered to assess our arguments and decide for themselves. We're saying, no, it isn't just kitsch or stereotype or one big racist joke. We're saying these images have tremendous power, and if you look closer, they can be decoded to reveal deeper meanings. This felt way better than dumping massive amounts of information on them. Visitors don't seek information. If they were, information has never been easier or cheaper to obtain than now. What visitors want is experience and meaning. They want to learn more about a topic they already know, something about and are interested in. And they want to feel affirmed and to feel smart. And most of all, they want to understand how it relates to their lives. This isn't what they say if you ask them. This is what I know from 30 years as a curator. Something else that's weird and striking about Indians everywhere, especially at our present moment, when it feels like the country hasn't been this divided since 1861, is how remarkable it is that the phenomenon crosses every demographic, every taste, every region, every political viewpoint. In the show, we have nearly identical tour T-shirts. One is from Kanye West, one from Lynyrd Skynyrd, with the same Indian death head feathered skull. A broad range. As you probably know, exhibitions like this take a small village, and I want to acknowledge my partner in this enterprise, the formidable scholar and curator Cecile Argentome. University of Press is publishing her book called Officially Indian, and it'll be out soon. You'll be seeing lots of her once we begin rolling out Americans in the next few months. The show is being constructed as we speak, and one of the key pieces is an actual Tomahawk missile, and the grand entry into the gallery was some weeks ago. There's a famous line dissing rock critics. This is writing about music is like dancing to architecture. And that's sort of how I feel about describing an exhibition before it opens. So I'm not going to show you these pretty renderings of it. But I will tell you about some of the people featured in the Central Gallery in Americans. They include Albert Einstein, Elvis Presley, FDR, Karlie Kloss, Ted Turner, Robert Griffin III, Jimmy Hoffa, Michelle Obama, Tim McGraw, Boris Karloff, Cher, Harry Belafonte. I fully expect they'll come to life after closing each night. Imagine the parties. The funny thing about curating at the Smithsonian is that we have a guaranteed audience most museums would kill for, 1 million people a year. But that doesn't translate into impact, and that's what we're after. Will Americans be in your head 3 days later when you look in your pantry and see that baking powder wearing feathered hats, or hear Peggy Lee singing about Pocahontas in a crowded bar, or when Little Bighorn is referenced on CNN about a losing political campaign? The awesome accomplishment of the Indians Everywhere phenomenon is the incredible staying power of stories like Thanksgiving and Trail of Tears. They've taken up real estate in our heads and show no signs of leaving. Indians Everywhere is a forever kind of thing. And what we think about it, how we decode it, how we understand it, well, that's always changing. Indians Everywhere is part of the furniture in the American living room, and the exhibition proposes to rearrange that furniture. Because you know what? It's past due for a makeover. Can it really be done? Steal back the franchise? Here's some friendly advice. Don't bet against us. Okay, that's it. Love you guys. Peace out. I will take 3 questions. I love stunned silence. It's my favorite thing.
Okay, so what's your retort? Well, what's your retort for the most critical remarks you expect from Indian people?
About the exhibition?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. It's one of the things that's harder about explaining it than seeing it. But I fully understand as being, a voice in how this conversation about this imagery has developed over the last few decades, that there are Indian activists who believe all of this is some form of hate speech. So, for example, the Washington R words, right, the NFL franchise in D.C. My museum has taken a very strong stand about that. It organized a very influential symposium that drew a lot of native and non-native speakers and scholars. And it was very influential in D.C. At one point, there were like 8 different people from the Washington Post covering it. There was Mike Wise, a really important sports columnist. So we've been unequivocal. That name is a dictionary-defined slur. No one would ever use it. And it's evidence that I see all the time that is about the lack of power of Native people. Because other ethnic groups, it just wouldn't be there. So that's, except for Standing Rock in the last 10 years, you could say the debate over these issues about the sports teams has been more national than anything else in Indian country, right? And so that's kind of troubling in a way. I mean, the Washington R words have won like 2 playoff games this century, right? They're not exactly, a happening thing. And yet because the NFL is so much more important than Indian people are, there's all this attention to it. So I guess what I'm hoping is people will be able to see 2 things. Some of this imagery is straight up racist and demeaning and needs to change. But when here's an exercise for folks. Pull up on Google Images Native American stereotypes and African American stereotypes. The whole thing about Native American stereotypes is it really, I use the term romanticism. Some percentage of it is vicious and racist, but most of it is the noble Indian. Most of it is very flattering. When you look at Native American stereotypes, I guarantee most people would not be able to look at that full page because some of it is so hateful and horrific. So the stereotype we fight about is this idea of Indians in the past. Indians today don't matter. and this making Indians noble and they wage all these things in a way that disempower the current realities. So I think for people who feel like, there are people who say we shouldn't even show any of that imagery in the National Museum of the American Indian. There are people who said that. What I hope is people will see this is making that issue larger. And it doesn't take away from the idea there are specific battles we have that we need to fight. But I feel like it's too easy that somehow, just solving that you could eliminate all this. And it's not saying, oh, well, that's history has to be preserved. It's saying it's about something really larger. And I think Native activists, I'm hoping, will think harder about how to leverage that into something that's really powerful.
So, for the smallest, probably, portion of your guests, the American Indian Native people who come to see this exhibit, how is it positioned to make that experience not painful, first of all? And second of all, how does it reach out to us? How do we get included in what, to me, just looks odious?
Yeah. Very good question as well. As you know, in MAI, its sort of brand is this very close alliance with Native tribes. So when we opened, we had 24 exhibits in which we work extremely closely with Native communities. A very expensive process of traveling, and a third of them were in Latin America. They weren't even in the U.S. And it was really offering, as Rick West said, this is a chance to hear from Indian people directly. There's a thing about audio that Kevin Gove, I don't know if you know this, but he was BIE. He ran the BIE under the Clinton administration, and had a law practice. He's very, very focused on U.S. Indian tribes and us being very tightly aligned with them. And that's a core demographic. So even though Indians are not a huge percentage of who visits, I assure you, Indians are a huge part of our programming, our consciousness, everything about it. Our cafe is, a meeting for all kinds of Indian folks doing business all the time. So it's not like, oh, well, that's only 3% and that's not important. It's hugely important. So as far as how people will receive this, what my experience is Indian people are ultra fascinated with this imagery and how people understand it. And we all have our own relationships with it over time. So I think it's going to react for Indian people in some ways similar to other people, which is these are objects and imagery that Part of this main gallery, Indians Everywhere. For those of you who know the museum, this is the largest space of any exhibit since we opened in 2004. It's over 100 feet long, 30 feet wide, and it's mostly these 3D objects. But in a curved wall, there are these projections, and it's showing clips from movies and TVs, and everything from Get Smart and F Troop to The Searchers, all of these things. So we have connections to this that are obviously different than non-Indians. But we also know its power, and we know that this is what most of the country thinks and knows about us. So, when we opened the museum, there was this idea Indians will receive the exhibitions really differently than non-Indians. And that's true if you're from a particular tribe and you know the backstory. But often it's not as different. Indian people aren't born knowing everything about history, everything about every Indian tribe. So I always curate and write with a particular interest in my Indian audience. But I remember during the controversy with Sam Durant, who I like and admire, he said something about he made that work for white people. And I thought, bingo, that's a moment that we should say that's an obsolete idea, that you can make work for just a certain group. You can have an interest in it. But the work has to be accessible and useful to very different audiences at the same time. So I'm very hopeful that this will be as fascinating, if not more, for Native people, that they'll have their own readings, their own connection, their own ways into it. Seems like we're good, right? One more?
A lot of artists in this region manipulate this imagery and comment on it in a lot of different ways. Have you thought of art? Is there art by Native artists in the show that would provide that kind of perspective or critique?
Did you say art by Native or non-Native artists? By Native artists. Yeah, I mean, when I look at a lot of Native artwork, a lot of it is deeply engaged in critiquing and unpacking this imagery. So I think it's something where artists have led in many ways to look at that. I will say sometimes I feel like it's catering to a certain audience. In other words, it's preaching to the choir, because who's actually seeing this and who's challenged by it, that it can sort of reward white left liberal people because they know all this is wrong, who are you reaching? So I wonder about that, but I feel like a lot of the conversation about this has taken direction from artists and looked at how people have critiqued, because artists know the power of the visual imagery. They know how important that is. So certainly in our programming, certainly we want to involve all kinds of people to talk about, how they see this and how to understand it. The phenomenon is so huge, we don't think there's just one simple way to say, okay, here's what it means. It means different things at different times, and that's what I think artists can help us talk about. That was 3 questions. One more?
So before your caveat, you kind of made some comments about artists and known weirdos should at least be skeptical of the state. And so I wondered, at least that was my interpretation of the comment, I wonder if you think there should be any regulation of identity with respect to Indian artists. And I would welcome any comment about how that might have an impact on economic factors. So Indian Arts and Crafts Board or others that are looking at the cultural economy and saying, should it be taxed? Should it be regulated in any form? Or should that be left to curators and critics and kind of an environment of the skeptics?
The funny thing about the Jimmie Durham situation is that I've always been very militant about fake Indians. Any civilian person who wants to be Indian, I don't care about that. But when people exaggerate and make up things and get an academic position or have shows, I've always been militant about that. We had fake Indians in AIM. We had all these people who misrepresented things. What you do about it is really hard, and I think with the arts it's really hard. So I think it's messy, and I don't think there's some kind of solution to it. That's what's frustrating, with all of this, is wanting some kind of strict policy. But I don't think that means, therefore, because there's not a perfect solution, nothing can be done. I think it's going to be messy. I think the Indian world is messy, and I think issues of citizenship and who has a right to say that they're Native is always going to be really complicated. Okay, thank you, everybody.